Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are walking into some territory that, well, it usually gets people shouting at each other before they've even finished their coffee.
That's putting it mildly.
But we're going to try and do something a little different. We are looking at a stack of documents. We've got articles, sociological papers, some really dense historical analyses that all take a look at the Quran.
And right off the bat, we need to set the ground rules. Because usually when you talk about this text, you fall into one of two camps. It's either a devotional reading where everything is perfect, or it's a polemic where everything is evil.
And this is neither.
This is neither. We're trying to step outside of that.
Exactly. This is not a theological sermon. We aren't here to discuss faith in the devotional sense. We aren't here to preach, and we certainly aren't here to tell you what to believe about the afterlife.
Right. The mission statement for this deep dive is, it's pretty specific. We are looking at this text as a mechanism of authority.
A mechanism of authority.
Yeah. The sources we have describe it as a constitution for a totalitarian society. Now, before anyone panics or, turns off the audio, we need to clarify that word.
A very loaded word.
It's incredibly loaded. But they are using totalitarian in the neutral sociological sense.
Meaning a system that covers the totality of a person's life, from waking to sleeping.
Exactly. In political science, a totalitarian system isn't necessarily just about, guys in jackboots kicking down doors, though it can include that.
Right.
It refers to a system that regulates the private, the public, the political, the economic, and the spiritual. It leaves no vacuum. It offers a complete script for existence.
So our goal, then, is to look at the text as a technology of power.
That's the phrase. A technology.
We're stripping away the apologetics, the stuff that tries to make it sound nice to modern ears, and also the polemics, the angry attacks. We are just trying to look at the raw function of the text.
How does it work?
Yeah, how does the engine turn? How does it organize the civilization?
It's like we're taking an engine apart to see how the gears turn. We're going to look at the historical context, the psychological levers, military strategy, economic structures, and we'll even compare it to other systems like Hinduism and Marxism later on.
It's fascinating because usually you only get that surface-level debate. Is it peaceful? Is it violent? But this is so much deeper. The sources argue this 7th century document operates as a complete civilizational ecosystem.
It's a full operating system for humanity. And to understand it, the sources say you have to start with the architecture, the foundation.
The architecture of authority.
Exactly. And if you look at the source material, the first pillar of this architecture, the foundation everything else sits on, is what they call the finality clause.
This is the concept of Khatam and Nabiyin, right? I saw that come up again and again.
Yes, the seal of the prophets, which you find in Surah 33, verse 40. This is the structural lock on the door. It is the key to the whole building.
Okay, seal of the prophets. So by declaring Muhammad the final messenger, what does that do practically?
It does something massive. Think about it. If you declare that the channel to the divine is permanently closed, forever, you delegitimize any future reform.
Any new ideas.
Any new revelation. You delegitimize any critique from inside or outside.
So if someone comes along, say, 200 years later or 1,400 years later and says, hey, I think we should maybe change this law about inheritance because our economy has changed.
The system simply points to the sign on the door, and the sign says, closed for business.
Wow.
The system's response is impossible. It delegitimizes the very idea of an update. It locks the political and legal structure of that society into the context of 7th century Arabia.
So the civilization is forced to look backward for legitimacy. Forever.
Forever. You can't iterate, you can't update the software, you can only try to emulate the past with perfect fidelity.
That is a massive constraint on a civilization. It effectively freezes time. Most legal systems, like the U.S. Constitution, they have amendment mechanisms built in for a reason.
This is a constitution without an amendment clause.
And within that frozen time, the text builds a very specific worldview. The sources we have call this the binary worldview.
And this is another core component, the in-group and the out-group.
Believers and disbelievers.
Mu'minun, the believers, and kafirun, the disbelievers. This is an absolutely strict dichotomy. There is no gray area. You are one or the other. And the sources point out the psychological impact of this binary.
It's not just a benign label.
Oh, not at all. The text often dehumanizes the outgroup, calling them things like the worst of creatures.
It's pretty harsh language. It's not just those guys over there who are wrong.
No, it's visceral. Other descriptions are cattle, filth, deaf, dumb, and blind. This isn't just name-calling, it's functional. It's a technology.
A technology for what?
For fostering strong in-group cohesion. If you are told you're part of the best of people raised up for mankind and they are subhuman, it becomes very easy to justify antagonism. It creates a psychological wall that is much, much harder to climb than any physical wall.
And it simplifies morality too, doesn't it? It feels like a shortcut.
It is a shortcut. Goodness isn't defined by universal ethics like, is he a kind neighbor, or does she give to charity? Goodness becomes defined purely by alignment with the text.
It's a loyalty
A
test.
loyalty test to the system. A good person is a compliant believer. A bad person is a disbeliever, regardless of their personal virtues or charitable works.
And that loyalty is enforced through what the sources call unquestionable obedience. I kept seeing this formula pop up in the notes. Obey Allah and obey the messenger. Over and over.
That phrase is the linchpin. It's the point where the divine and the political merge into one. It fuses metaphysical authority, God, with political authority, the messenger.
Which is, I mean, it's brilliant if you're trying to centralize power in a tribal society full of feuding clans.
It's absolutely essential. In a tribal society, you have constant infighting. You have blood feuds, your loyalties to your kin. By fusing the two, disobedience to the leader isn't just a political crime.
It's a sin.
It's apostasy. It's a rebellion against the creator of the universe. This allows for an absolute centralization of power that was unthinkable before. It's the bedrock of the entire caliphate system.
So you have the authority structure set, you have the lock on the door with finality, you have the binary worldview, and you have the fusion of God and state. But a system needs more than just a rule book. It needs motivation. You can't just order people around. You have to make them want to comply.
Right. And this brings us to section 2 in the analysis, the psychology of control, or as you could call it, the carrot and the stick.
And the stick here is, well, it's a very, very big stick, Jahannam, hellfire.
And we have to be specific here because the analysis in the sources is very clear. The descriptions are incredibly graphic. We are not talking about a vague absence of God or a sort of spiritual sadness.
No, I was looking at the notes. It details skins being roasted, then replaced with new skins so they can be roasted again, over and over.
Drinking boiling water that melts the intestines, garments of fire.
It feels like a script for a horror movie. So the question is, why so graphic? Why not just say, it will be bad?
The source calls it shock doctrine. It's not aimed at your prefrontal cortex, your logic center. It targets the amygdala, the brain's fear center.
It's designed to bypass logic entirely.
Entirely. It creates a high-stakes wager in the mind of the believer. It's my doubt, is my questioning, worth this specific eternal torture. The sheer terror of the description is meant to shut down critical thinking.
And that has a function in society.
A huge one. It acts as a self-policing mechanism. I mean, think about the economics of policing a society. A police force is expensive. You have to pay salaries, buy equipment, patrol the streets. But fear.
Fear is free.
Fear is free. If you truly believe an all-seeing God is watching you 204/7 and will literally burn your skin off for eternity if you disobey, you police yourself.
You don't need a cop on every corner.
You create a low-surveillance, high-compliance society. People adhere to the dietary laws, the sexual laws, the financial laws, even when nobody is looking, because God is always looking.
But it's not just the fear of hell after you die. The sources talk a lot about the fear of being a hypocrite, the munafiqun.
Ah, yes. This is what the analysis calls the internal panopticon. A panopticon is that prison design where the guard can see all the prisoners, but they can't see the guard, so they always act as if they're being watched.
So this is an internal version of that.
Exactly. The text is constantly, relentlessly attacking those who outwardly conform but inwardly doubt. This induces a state of paranoia. You are constantly monitoring your own thoughts for deviance.
And you're watching your neighbor. Is he praying sincerely enough? Did she seem a little half-hearted about that? Or is he a hypocrite?
It creates intense peer pressure. It weaponizes the community against itself to ensure total conformity.
Yeah.
Everyone becomes a guardian of the ideology, policing themselves and each other.
Okay, so that's the stick, a very effective, multi-layered stick. What about the carrot? Paradise. Jhana.
And the promise of paradise is just as sensory and physical as the threat of hell. It's not an abstract spiritual realm. It's described with very concrete details.
Rivers of wine, which is interesting since it's forbidden on Earth.
Rivers of wine, milk and honey, silk robes, gold bracelets, reclining on plush couches, and of course the promise of sexual companions, the houris.
And the source material is very explicit in framing this as a military recruitment tool.
You have to think about the target demographic. We're talking about 7th century desert tribesmen living in extreme scarcity. Life was hard, it was hot, it was dry. Resources were incredibly sparse.
So this was a high-value offer.
It was an unbelievable offer. It mobilized men for war. It completely reframed the concept of death.
Death isn't the end. It isn't even a loss.
No, death in battle becomes a gateway to an immediate, massive sensory upgrade. That is a powerful, powerful military psychological tool. If your soldiers are not afraid of death, if they actually welcome it as a promotion, you have an almost unstoppable force.
Which transitions us perfectly to Section 3, warfare, evolution, and this concept of abrogation. This part of the analysis was really helpful for me because it clears up that constant debate about whether the text is peaceful or violent.
Because the answer is it's both. It's an evolution. The verses regarding violence evolve based on the military and political strength of the community. It's highly strategic.
So walk us through the stages the sources lay out.
Okay, so stage 1 is passive resistance. This is the early Meccan period. The Muslims are a small, weak minority surrounded by hostile, powerful tribes. The verses from this time command patience, avoidance, turning the other cheek.
Things like, to you be your religion, and to me mine.
Exactly. Because if they had picked a fight then, they'd have been wiped out in an afternoon. It's a survival strategy.
So it's not pacifism out of a core principle, but pacifism out of necessity.
The analysis argues it's pragmatism. Then you move to stage 2, defensive permission. This is early Medina. They've migrated. They have a small state now, but it's fragile. It's surrounded by enemies.
So now they can fight back.
Yes. Permission is granted to fight, but only if attacked. It's about consolidating power and defending the new community.
And then stage 3.
Offensive declaration. This is late Medina. The state is now a dominant regional power. They've won key battles. Now the command changes again. It becomes an obligation to fight to subdue rival powers and expand the state.
And this is where you get verses like, fight them until there is no more persecution and religion is all for Allah.
Precisely. The goal has shifted from survival to defense to imperialism.
So the text literally changes as the political reality on the ground changes.
And this is where the doctrine of abrogation, or NASC, becomes absolutely critical to understanding the system. The analysis calls it the software update mechanism.
I saw that reference to Surah 2.106.
Yeah.
It says later verses can cancel out earlier ones.
Yes. The verse says, essentially, if we abrogate a verse or cause it to be forgotten, we bring one better than it or like it. It's a built-in mechanism for change.
And the most famous example of this, and the most controversial, is the sword verse.
Surah 9, verse 5. It's from one of the last revelations.
Huh.
And it commands believers to slay the idolaters wherever you find them.
And according to classical jurisprudence,
According to the classical jurists, the people who built the legal framework of the Islamic Empire for centuries, this late aggressive verse is viewed as abrogating or canceling out over 100 earlier, more peaceful, more tolerant verses.
so hang on, this is the core of the conflict. When a modern radical quotes that violent verse, he
is, according to the classical mainstream legal tradition, textually and temporally correct. He is quoting the latest software update.
and the moderate who quotes the early peaceful Meccan verses
Is, in the eyes of that same classical jurisprudence, quoting old code. He's citing a verse that has been overwritten by a subsequent patch.
That is a heavy realization. It explains why the argument never seems to end. The text contains both, but the internal system of the text prioritizes the later, more violent ones.
It does, and you have to layer on top of this what the analysis calls the transaction of martyrdom. It's from Surah 9, verse 111.
This is the one where Allah purchases lives.
Yes. Allah has purchased from the believers their lives and their properties in exchange for paradise. They fight in the cause of Allah, so they kill and are killed.
It gamifies war. It turns it into a business deal.
It absolutely does. It reframes war as a commercial contract. Death is simply the closing of an incredibly profitable business deal. This is the root logic for modern martyrdom operations. In their worldview, it's not suicide, it's a trade. You give the temporary your life for the eternal paradise.
Okay, let's move from the battlefield to the home, the social structure. Section 4. The sources talk a lot about this shift from tribe to ummah.
This was a truly revolutionary sociological shift. Pre-Islamic Arabia was based on blood kinship. Your loyalty was to your kin, your clan, right or wrong. The Quran completely demolishes that.
And replaces it with what?
It replaces blood loyalty with ideological loyalty. Your new tribe is the ummah, the global community of believers.
What's the practical consequence of that?
It allowed for the creation of a superstate. Suddenly, you could unite all these warring Arab tribes under a single banner. An Arab from one tribe could fight his own brother if that brother was a disbeliever because his primary loyalty was now to Allah and the Ummah.
It creates a new form of citizenship based on belief rather than biology.
That's a perfect way to put it.
But what about the people in conquered lands who didn't join? The Jews and Christians, the people of the book.
This is where the dhimmi system comes into play. Surah 9, verse 29, establishes their status very clearly. They were allowed to exist, unlike polytheists, who in the later stages generally had a convert or die choice.
But they weren't equals.
Not at all. They were second-class citizens. They had to pay a special protection tax, the jizya, in a state of humiliation, as the verse says.
So the tax was a revenue stream.
It was a massive revenue stream.
Yeah.
And this is a really important point for understanding the rapid expansion of the early empire. It created a powerful economic incentive for conquest without forced conversion.
Wait, unpack that for me. That sounds counterintuitive. Usually you think a religious conquest is all about making everyone convert to your faith.
Theologically, yes, that's the ideal end goal. But practically, from an economic standpoint, if everyone in Syria and Egypt converts to Islam, they stop paying the jizya tax.
And your tax base disappears overnight.
It collapses. So the early empire actually needed a large subject population of Jews and Christians to keep working the land, paying taxes, and funding the state and the army, while the Arab Muslims did the ruling and the fighting.
That's very pragmatic almost. Almost like a mafia protection racket economic model.
It's an incredibly effective and pragmatic system for running an empire. Now, the source has this really interesting deep dive comparison with Hinduism. At first, I wouldn't have thought to compare the two, but when you look at the structure, the differences really clarify how the Quranic system operates.
A study in contrasts.
A huge one. Look at authority. The Quran is centralized, it's top-down, it's text-based, it's a pyramid with God at the top. Hinduism is largely decentralized, it's guru-based, it's highly interpretative, it's more like a network.
What about their concept of time?
The Quran views time as linear and urgent. You have one life, one straight line from birth to death to judgment. You get one chance to get it right and avoid hell. This creates a sense of anxiety and drive.
And Hinduism.
Hinduism views time as cyclical, samsara. You have potentially infinite lives through reincarnation.
Which changes the pressure completely.
Totally. If you fail this life, you might come back as a lesser being, but you get another shot. In the Quranic model, the stakes are infinite and immediate. There are no second chances.
And hierarchy.
Quranic hierarchy is based on belief and gender. The believer is above the unbeliever. The man is above the woman. The Hindu hierarchy is the caste system based on karma and birth. Different inputs, but both create rigid social structures.
But the sources say they share one key aspect: purity.
Yes. Both systems have an obsessive focus on fluids, on ritual washing, on what is pure, tahir, and what is impure, najis. It seems to be a universal trait of religious control systems, regulating the physical body as a way to regulate the person.
Speaking of regulating the body, let's move to Section 5. Women, slavery, and what the sources call biopolitics. This is where that totalitarian label really fits, because the system enters the home, the bedroom, the body itself.
Right, and the legal status of women in the Quran it's a complex picture. The text did bring some major reforms for its time. It granted women inheritance rights, for instance, and it banned female infanticide, which was common.
So we have to acknowledge that 7th century Arabia was not a great place for women, and the text improved certain aspects.
Absolutely, the sources are clear on that.
And
But
it also codified subordination.
it didn't just suggest it, it wrote it into what is considered eternal divine law. A woman's testimony in court is worth half a man's. Men can have up to 4 wives, but women only 1 husband. And then there's the verse in Surah 4, verse 34.
The so-called wife-beating verse.
Yes. The root word used is idribuhuna, which means to strike or to hit. Modern apologists often try to soften this, saying it means to separate from or to tap lightly, but the classical commentaries and the philological root are quite clear. It authorizes physical discipline to maintain the household hierarchy.
The underlying psychology seems to be that women need to be managed.
And that the burden of male sexual discipline is placed on the woman. She must cover herself, she must lower her gaze so that he doesn't sin. It externalizes the responsibility for male desire onto the female body and her attire.
And then there is slavery. The text frequently mentions what your right hands possess.
And this is a really important point. The Quran codified slavery. It regulated it. Yes, it encouraged freeing slaves as an act of piety, but it did not abolish it. The phrase, what your right hands possess, is a legal euphemism for slaves. And we have to talk about sexual slavery specifically.
This is Surah 4, verse 24.
That's the one. This verse explicitly permits men to have sexual intercourse with their female captives of war. The historical context provided in the supporting texts, the hadith, is that some of the soldiers were hesitant to sleep with captured women who were already married to enemy soldiers. This verse clarified that the act of captivity dissolves a woman's previous marriage, making her sexually lawful for her captor.
That is incredibly dark.
It is, but it explains the logic we saw with groups like ISIS in the modern era. When they captured Yazidi women and distributed them as sex slaves, they weren't just being evil in a chaotic, random way. They were following their interpretation of the text, literally. They viewed these women as property, as war booty distributed by God.
The source material also brings up something called the castration factor in the trans-Saharan slave trade.
This is a grim historical reality that is often glossed over. While the transatlantic slave trade was brutal, it primarily sought laborers. The Islamic slave trade, which lasted much longer, had a huge demand for eunuchs to guard harems and serve in palaces.
And this involved the massive castration of African men.
On an industrial scale. And what this does from a demographic perspective is it explains the lack of a large African diaspora in the Middle East today compared to the Americas.
Because they couldn't reproduce.
The slaves were biologically culled. It was a genetic dead end for millions. It's a key difference between the two slave trades that the analysis highlights.
And this all ties into this idea of biopolitics from the philosopher Foucault.
Yes. Biopolitics is about how power is exerted directly on the body, and the Quranic system is a masterclass in this. It includes the micromanagement of the body through rules about everything. Istinja, the detailed rules for bathroom etiquette, the length of the beard, sexual segregation.
Why regulate how a person uses the bathroom?
Because if the ideology can dictate your most private, animalistic moments, it penetrates the deepest layers of your psyche. There is no private time away from God. There is no secular self that you can retreat into. You are a Muslim when you pray, when you trade, and when you are in the bathroom. It's total immersion.
Let's shift gears to economics, section 6. The analysis argues that the Quranic structure actually, and perhaps unintentionally, held back long-term economic development.
It's a fascinating argument. It centers on what the sources call the inheritance trap. The Quran outlines very specific, complex, fractional inheritance rules. A daughter gets half of what a son gets, wives get an eighth or a quarter, and so on.
And what this meant practically.
It meant that wealth fragmented every single generation. A large family estate or a successful business would be broken up into tiny, unviable pieces upon the owner's death.
And you can compare that to the system in Europe.
In much of Europe, you had primogeniture. The eldest son often inherited the entire estate. Now, that sounds incredibly unfair to the other siblings, and it was. But from a purely economic standpoint, it allowed for capital accumulation.
You could build a massive estate or a business that lasted for centuries?
Exactly. It kept capital consolidated. In the Islamic world, it was very difficult to build a multi-generational business empire because it was designed to be broken up by law. Plus, there was no legal concept of corporate personhood, the idea that a company is a legal person separate from its owners.
They had something called the waqf.
Yes, the religious trust or endowment. But the waqf was static. It was designed to freeze capital for a specific religious purpose, like funding a mosque or a school, forever. It wasn't dynamic, like a corporation that can invest and grow and adapt. It's a perfect example of how a theological rule can have massive unintended economic consequences centuries down the line.
And within this system, the sources talk about a kind of Arab supremacy.
Or linguistic imperialism. The idea is that God only speaks Arabic. The Quran is the Arabic text. Any translation is considered merely an interpretation, a shadow of the real thing.
So if you're a Persian or an Indonesian or a Bosnian,
you must use a foreign language for your most intimate spiritual moments. It creates an inherent hierarchy. The Arab is closer to the source code, so to speak. And you see this in the practice of converts changing their names to Arab names.
which implies your own birth culture was Jahiliyyah from the age of ignorance.
Exactly. It's a subtle but powerful form of cultural erasure. And historically, it created a caste system where the Mawali, the non-Arab converts, were often treated as second-class clients to the Arab tribes who had converted first.
Okay, this brings us to section 7. Information warfare and the invisible system. This is all about how truth is handled.
And the core idea here is that truth is often seen as instrumental. In Western liberalism, we generally treat truth as an absolute value in itself. In this system, as described by the sources, truth serves the interests of the ideology.
And this leads to concepts like taqiyya.
Taqiyya, which is the concealment of one's belief under duress, it originated for survival like Shias hiding their identity from Sunnis who might kill them. But in a modern political context, it can evolve into a strategic prudence, allowing for the downplaying of controversial aspects of the faith to avoid friction with outsiders.
And then there's kitman omission.
This is probably the most common tool you'll encounter. It's not lying, it's just telling part of the truth. The classic example is quoting the beautiful verse that says, "If anyone slays a person, it is as if he slew the whole people."
It does sound wonderful. It's very similar to a passage in the Talmud.
It is, but what is almost always omitted is the very next verse, which commands execution, crucifixion, or amputation for those who spread corruption in the land. By omitting the context, you can present a sanitized, humanistic version of the law to an outsider, while technically not having lied.
It allows you to appear moderate while remaining textually accurate in what you do say.
And then there's Tariya creative ambiguity, using words with double meanings. When a leader says, "We want peace," they might mean the state of the world when Islam is dominant. Because in their theology, true peace is only achieved when Islam rules, while the Western listener hears, "We want pluralistic coexistence."
You're using two different dictionaries.
Precisely. The words are the same, but the meanings are worlds apart.
We also need to touch on eschatology, the end times narrative.
This is huge. The coming of the Mahdi, a messianic figure, the return of Jesus, but with a twist, he returns to break the cross and affirm Islam.
And the source material connects this directly to the geopolitics of Iran and ISIS.
You absolutely cannot understand the geopolitics of the region without the theology. The Iranian regime, for instance, is structurally designed to prepare for the return of the Mahdi, but the prophecies say the Mahdi comes when the world is full of chaos and tyranny.
So,
Is actually seen as part of the divine plan. It can be interpreted as accelerating the apocalyptic timeline. And ISIS, they believed that reestablishing the caliphate was a non-negotiable prerequisite for the final battles of the apocalypse. They were actively trying to turn the key to end the world.
there's also this specific mention in the hadith of the Garkad tree.
Yes, and this relates to the metaphysical nature of the anti-Semitism found in some of the texts. There's a prophecy of a final war where the Muslims will fight the Jews, and the trees and stones will call out to the Muslims saying, "There is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him."
Except for this one specific tree, the Garkad tree.
Right, which is called the Tree of the Jews. The point of highlighting this is that it frames the modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict not as a simple land dispute, but as a preordained cosmic war. You can't sign a lasting peace treaty to avert the apocalypse.
And finally, in this section, we have the scientific miracle strap.
Mhm.
This is sometimes called bucalism.
Named after a French doctor, Maurice Bucaille. It's the method of going through the Quran and retroactively fitting vague, poetic verses to modern scientific discoveries. For example, saying a verse about the heavens and earth being joined together is a prediction of the Big Bang.
But the sources we're looking at call this a trap. Why?
For two reasons. First, it validates faith via the authority of Western science. But this makes the faith fragile. What happens if the science changes tomorrow? The whole theological argument cracks. Second, it's a massive exercise in confirmation bias, ignoring the clear scientific errors in the text.
Like what?
Like the Quran describing the sun setting in a muddy spring, or stars being described as missiles that God fires at devils. You can't claim it's a science book when it predicts embryology, but then ignore the parts that reflect 7th century cosmology.
Okay, that brings us to our final section, Section 8, the psychology of the believer and the moderate paradox. Let's start with predestination.
Al-Qadar, the concept of the sealed heart. The text repeatedly says that God guides whom he wills and leads astray whom he wills.
Which, logically, creates a sense of fatalism.
Yes, Maktub, it is written. If everything is already written, then resistance to the status quo is not only difficult, it's futile. It's rebelling against God's own will. This is a very powerful tool for stabilizing a society and discouraging dissent.
And then there's the exit cost. What happens if you stop believing? Apostasy.
The sources use the Hotel California dynamic. You can check in anytime you like, but you can never leave. In classical Islamic law, apostasy is not a private matter of conscience. It's treason against the state, and it carries the death penalty.
In the modern world, this leads to what's called coercive retention.
Exactly. We see numbers saying there are 1.8 billion Muslims, but how many of those are Muslim only because they live in a country where they would be killed, imprisoned, or socially ostracized if they openly left the faith? It artificially inflates the numbers and creates an intellectual bubble.
And this all builds up to what the analysis calls the moderate's dilemma.
This is the absolute crux of the entire reform issue today. The modern moderate Muslim has sentiment. They have good intentions. They want peace. They want to coexist. They believe in human rights. The fundamentalist has the text.
And in a system where the text is held to be the literal, perfect, unchanging word of God.
The fundamentalist wins the argument every single time. The system has what the sources call a scriptural immune system. It is designed to attack innovators and reformers as heretics, as people who are corrupting the perfect word of God. You cannot reform the literal word of God. You can only obey it more perfectly.
The comparison to Marxism here at the end was really striking.
The parallels are fascinating. They both have utopian end goals, a promise of a perfect society. They both require total control over the individual. They both have a linear view of history marching towards a final conclusion. And they both identify an internal enemy that must be purged. The bourgeoisie for the Marxists, the kuffar for the Islamists.
And both seem to require totalitarian force because they are, in a sense, fighting against basic human nature. They are both systems that demand the complete remaking of man.
A new Soviet man, or a perfect submitted Muslim. Yes.
So, synthesizing all of this, bring it all together for the outro.
The sources conclude we are looking at a total institution, to use the sociological term. It's a system that controls time through the 5 daily prayers, diet through the halal laws, sex through strict segregation and rules, and information through that finality clause we started with.
And the sources call it anti-fragile. Not just resilient, but something that gets stronger from attacks.
Exactly. It protects itself from criticism by defining criticism as a sin. It protects itself from reform by defining itself as final and perfect. And it protects itself from defection by threatening death. It is an incredibly well-designed, self-perpetuating system.
And the final provocative thought here is about the clash with the modern world.
It suggests that the conflict we see isn't just a misunderstanding or a failure of diplomacy, it's a fundamental clash of operating systems.
An OS clash.
You have, on one side, an operating system based on absolute, divine, and often violent authority, and on the other, an OS based on relative, humanistic, and democratic authority. Those two systems they don't interface well. They grind against each other at every level.
That is a lot to process. We've covered the architecture, the psychology, the warfare, the economics, the social structure, and the hidden information mechanisms.
It's a masterclass in political theology. Whether one agrees with it or not, from a purely analytical standpoint, you have to respect the sheer effectiveness of the design.
This has been a heavy deep dive, but I think a necessary one to understand the mechanics of one of the most influential forces in human history.
Absolutely. Understanding this strategic glossary, as one source called it, and the machinery behind the curtain is the only way to navigate the reality of it.
Well, that is all the time we have for this deep dive. It's certainly given me a lot to think about regarding how systems of authority are built and maintained. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.